I'd like to welcome Jesse Gurovich. Jesse recently graduated from the University of Vermont Rubenstein School of Environment Natural Resources with a PhD in natural resources. He is currently a postdoc researcher with the Wharton Risk Center at the University of Pennsylvania and with the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at UC Davis. His research aims to understand the relationships among climate and land use change, ecological and hydrological processes, and economic and human health outcomes. For his dissertation, Jesse focused on assessing how the impacts of policies and practices designed to improve water quality and reduce flood risk are distributed among demographic and socioeconomic groups in Vermont's Lake Champlain Basin. Welcome, Jesse, and thank you for presenting today.
Thanks, Juliana, and thank you for this opportunity to present my work. I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you all today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards as well. So as Juliana mentioned, I'm going to be discussing a project that was a part of my dissertation, looking at the benefits and costs of reducing phosphorus loading associated with the TMDL, specifically in Missisquoi Bay. And this work has really been driven by a long-term interest of mine in better understanding how people and society value clean water. So first, some background and motivation on this project. I think as probably everyone on this webinar intuitively knows, reducing phosphorus loading and improving water quality has the potential to create really large benefits for society. I think it's this understanding that largely underpins the TMDL and much of water quality policy generally. But in general, the costs associated with reductions in phosphorus loading are pretty well known. They're well quantified, they're well understood. But the benefits to society in terms of the economic and health outcomes that result from improving water quality are not as well quantified, or if they are, they're often underestimated. I think it's important to quantify these benefits for really two main reasons. The first is that better understanding the value of these benefits, particularly the marginal benefits, can be really important for designing efficient and effective policy solutions. These might include Pigouvian taxes, cap and trade programs, or payment for ecosystem service schemes. The second reason is that I think that quantifying these benefits can be really important for generating both public and political support for interventions designed to reduce phosphorus. We know that the costs of this are often incurred upfront, whereas the benefits occur years or decades in the future. And I think better understanding the value of those benefits can generate support for them, support for these reductions in the present. So there are really four main research questions driving this project. The first is, what are the social benefits and costs associated with reductions in phosphorus loading? Two, how do these benefits and costs vary over time? Three, how do the applied discount rate and time horizon of analysis affect the estimated benefits of improvements in water quality? And later in the presentation, I'll dig into what I actually mean by the discount rate and time horizon. And lastly, and the big question I think is, do the benefits of water quality improvements actually outweigh the costs? So the study area for this analysis focused on Missisquoi Bay, and specifically the Vermont portion of the bay. As you can see in this figure on the right, much of the bay extends into Quebec, but due to data and modeling limitations, I was unable to capture that region in this study. So the area surrounding Missisquoi Bay is largely rural, agricultural, and is populated by small and mid-sized farms. There is some degree of tourism in the towns surrounding Missisquoi Bay, and the value of that is roughly $6 million annually, as measured by the meals rooms tax. In the last few decades, we've been seeing an increasing frequency and severity of harmful algal blooms, which are largely driven by both internal and external phosphorus loading to the bay. And in 2016, the EPA implemented the TMDL, which requires that phosphorus loading to the bay be reduced by 64% by 2038. In general, the state tracks the costs associated with reductions in phosphorus pretty closely, but the social benefits in terms of meeting the TMDL or other levels of phosphorus reduction are generally unknown. So I'll start with the cost side of things, and then I'll dig into the benefits, and then I'll end by comparing the two. So this table here is drawn from the Vermont Clean Water Initiative Performance Report. This report comes out annually and contains a lot of really valuable information. One piece of that is the costs associated with reductions in phosphorus loading annually and over time. So this shows the annual costs and the annual load reductions between 2016 and 2019. And then I just simply calculated the annual marginal costs associated with those reductions. So you can see in this third column that those annual marginal costs have gradually increased from $580 to over $1,200 in 2019. So what I was interested in was projecting these costs out into the future and looking at how much it might cost to actually meet this 64% reduction target, or for that matter, other levels of reduction. So with only 4 data points, it's a little bit hard to generate an accurate projection. So I took 2 distinct approaches to estimate what I think are probably a lower and upper bound cost projection. To estimate the lower bound, I simply assumed that these marginal costs will remain constant as reductions in phosphorus loading increase. And so to do that, I simply just averaged the marginal costs that we've seen between 2016 and 2019. And so that's indicated by that blue dotted line on the bottom. To estimate the upper bound costs, I assumed that these marginal costs will increase linearly as the load reduction increases. So to project that forward, I simply just fit a simple linear regression equation to those 4 data points. Then I looked at the cumulative total costs associated with different levels of load reductions by simply taking the integral of these 2 functions. So the lower bound total costs are indicated by the blue line on the bottom right. And as you can see, I estimate that the total cost of meeting the TMDL is roughly about $90 million. Under the upper bound approach, I estimate the total cost is just over 300 million. So that's a pretty wide band of uncertainty. But I think given that we're still fairly early on in the pathway to meeting the TMDL, there is a lot of uncertainty. And these 2 approaches simply provide an upper and lower bound for what those costs might look like. Now moving on to the benefits of improving water quality. I first want to talk about the conceptual framework that I use to estimate these benefits. So on the natural science side of things, there's been a lot of work done looking at different sources of phosphorus from the environment and how those interact with other drivers of water quality, such as weather, climate, and lake bathymetry, and how those inputs and other drivers then interact to affect different types of water quality indicators, such as total phosphorus, chlorophyll A, Secchi depth, or phycocyanin concentrations. And this pathway has really been well explained by the work done by the Vermont EPSCoR team. About 5 years ago, they published this paper in environmental research letters that essentially models this pathway, linking changes in phosphorus loading under a range of different climate scenarios and looking at water quality outcomes. Then on the more social science side of things, or in the environmental economics realm, there's been a lot of work done linking these changes in water quality indicators with different certain valued attributes of water quality, such as recreational opportunities, aesthetic quality, or avoided health risks, and linking those to certain economic and health outcomes. So looking at property values or tourism expenditures, or the avoided incidence of certain types of disease or illness. And again, about 5 years ago, John Erickson and Brian Voigt put out this report doing just this, looking at how changes in water quality in the lake are associated with a range of different economic outcomes in the state. So the gap that I really see here, and what I try to fill with this research, is linking these two really critical bodies of research. So looking at how changes in phosphorus loading from different sources affects water quality, and how that in turn has certain economic and health outcomes. And I think that addressing this gap is really critical for policy and management, where you want to know what is the impact on human well-being from a change in phosphorus. So going back to the work done by the Vermont EPSCoR team, they developed what's called an integrated assessment model, which I'll abbreviate as an IAM, which links changes in phosphorus loading under different climate change scenarios and projects out different water quality outcomes. They've built out this model on a daily time step between 2016 and 2050. And for computational reasons, this model assumes that all phosphorus reductions occur in 2016. So you can think about this, the model just kind of shutting off the tap on phosphorus, and there's no incremental change over time. I'll also mention that the model looks at a range of different climate change scenarios represented by representative concentration pathways, which are averaged across an ensemble of 5 global circulation models. This figure on the right provides a summary of some of the outputs from the IAM. I know there's a lot going on here, so I'll just walk you through it briefly. Each subplot indicates a different climate change scenario. So RCP 2.6, 4.5, etc. On the x-axis are bins of years, or 5-year bins, going out to 2050. And each bar indicates a different level of phosphorus load reduction. So 0% in dark red, moving all the way to 100% reduction in dark blue. On the y-axis is the number of days per year when chlorophyll A is above 50 micrograms per liter, which is considered to be a perhaps safe threshold for chlorophyll A concentrations. So I'd say the big takeaway from this figure is that these chlorophyll A concentrations are highly sensitive to the amount that phosphorus is reduced. And then there is some level of variation among climate change scenarios as well. So the next step in this methodological framework is linking observed variation in water quality, which is reported by these DEC water quality sensors that are positioned throughout the lake. Here I'm using a sensor that is within Missisquoi Bay, and you can see these different changes in water quality indicators in the plots below between 2005 and 2020. And linking this change in water quality with observed variation in a range of different economic and health outcomes. So the first benefit I look at here is the variation in property sale prices. I essentially fit a very simple statistical model between these two variables and consider the impact of water quality on property sales price. This is also known as a hedonic modeling approach. And what I found is that properties within 100 meters of the lake see a 3% increase in sale price associated with a unit decrease in chlorophyll A concentrations 1 month prior to that sale. For properties 100 meters to 500 meters from the lake, that effect size diminishes a little bit, although we see that there's a 1.2% increase in sale price associated with that unit decrease in chlorophyll A. And properties greater than half a kilometer from the lake see no effect on water quality. The next bucket of benefits I look at are changes in tourism revenues. So these are measured by monthly expenditures on meals, rooms, and alcohol. And this data is reported by most Vermont towns. And so again, I put a pretty simple statistical model looking at the association between water quality and these different expenditures. And what I found is that for a 1% decrease in chlorophyll A, there's a $9,800 monthly increase in expenditures. The last category of benefits I consider is a little bit different from the first two. I look at changes in the incidence of ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, that might be associated with changes in the frequency and severity of cyanobacteria concentrations. So in the last few years, there's been some really interesting work coming out of Dartmouth, as well as a consulting group based in New Hampshire, looking at the relative risk of ALS that might be affected by living near lakes with phycocyanin concentrations above a certain threshold. They look at a range of different lakes throughout New England. This includes Lake Champlain, and look at whether the incidence of ALS might be higher nearer to lakes with really frequent algal blooms. And what they find is that the relative risk of ALS increases by about 40% for individuals living near these lakes. So I consider how improving water quality might affect incidence of ALS, and then I place a monetary value on that change in incidence using a value statistical life calculation. So now getting into the results a little bit, this figure on the right shows the net present value of changes in property sales as compared to a baseline scenario where there's a 0% reduction in phosphorus, so nothing is done whatsoever. So each of these bars indicates the benefits to property sales under a different phosphorus load reduction scenario, as well as different RCP climate change scenarios. So as you can see, there's very little variation among climate change scenarios. However, as we increase the phosphorus load reduction, the net present value of property sales increases. Under the TMDL, we expect to see about a $7 million aggregate increase in property sales, whereas under a 100% reduction scenario, there's an $11 million increase. For tourism expenditures, I estimate that meeting the TMDL is expected to result in nearly $17 million increase in tourism expenditures, again, relative to that baseline scenario of doing nothing. And under the 100% reduction scenario, I expect to see that there's about $29 million increase in expenditures. For the avoided incidence of ALS, meeting the TMDL is expected to result in the reduction of approximately 1.4 cases of ALS over this 35-year time horizon, so going from 2016 to 2020. And under the 100% reduction scenario, there's a reduction of ALS cases of about 3.1. I was also interested in looking at how these annual benefits increase over time. So from the IAM modeling, we know that there's often a significant lag time between the time at which phosphorus load reductions occur, in this case, 2016, and when there are improvements to water quality. So associated with that, I assume that there would be increases in annual benefits going out into the future. And so what I found is that under the 64% reduction scenario, so that's this plot on the bottom left, these annual benefits combined across the three categories of benefits increased pretty significantly between 2020 and 2050. In 2020, the total value of benefits is 1.1 million, and that nearly doubles by 2050. Under the 100% reduction scenario, the annual value of benefits is $1.8 million, and then in 2050, that more than doubles. Sorry, in 2050, that more than doubles to 4.3 million. Now moving on to comparing some of these benefits and costs. And I want to reiterate here that these benefits and costs are estimated over this 35-year time horizon, so between 2016 and 2050. And that becomes really important a bit further on in the analysis. This figure on the right shows the costs associated with each reduction scenario in red, and then the total value of benefits as shown by the blue, tan, and green stacked bars. In each figure, I also indicate the benefit cost ratio as the number above these bars. So under the 20% reduction scenario, that benefit cost ratio is 0.31. Under the TMDL, it's 0.39. And under the 100% reduction scenario, it's 0.45. So I think there is some optimism to be found that that benefit cost ratio is increasing at higher levels of phosphorus reduction. So now I want to pause for a second and discuss this concept of discounting and discount rates and how it applies to environmental policy analysis. And then I'll move on to indicating how these results might be sensitive to the applied discount rate. So for many environmental challenges, policy analysis requires weighing benefits and costs that occur in the present versus those that occur in the future. Discounting and discount rates are essentially a tool that's used to value these future benefits and costs relative to benefits and costs that occur in the present. Discount rates are generally represented as a percentage. And in general, the lower the discount rate that's used, the less that you're discounting future values. So for example, when the discount rate is zero, $1,000 in 2100 is the same as $1,000 in 2020. Under a 1% discount rate, $1,000 in 2100 is equivalent to $450 in 2020. And as that discount rate increases, that dollar value in the future becomes substantially less due to the compounding nature of discount rates. This figure on the right essentially shows a graphical representation of this example. I'd say in general, applying higher discount rates makes it less likely for society to enact policies and undertake certain actions that address environmental issues. This is largely because the costs of these policies are incurred upfront, whereas the benefits may occur years, decades, or even centuries into the future. So by using a higher discount rate, you're assuming that the value of those benefits is relatively less than the value of those costs. This has been played out in a number of policy contexts, probably the most prominent of which is how different presidential administrations have measured the social cost of carbon, or essentially the economic estimate of damages from carbon emissions. The Obama administration generally favored lower discount rates between 3 and 5%, whereas the Trump administration favored higher discount rates closer to 7%. But you can see in this figure between the dark blue and light blue lines, there's a pretty significant difference in these social cost estimates, even between the 3 and 5% estimates used by the Obama administration. So I think as you can, intuit from this example, the appropriate discount rate to use in environmental decision making is really hotly debated among economists and ethicists, and this has really been playing out particularly in the climate policy debate. But as I'll show in a second, these discount rate decisions also have really important implications for water quality policy as well. So in this slide, I look at the sensitivity of these benefit cost analyses to two different factors. The first of which is the discount rate, and the second of which is the time horizon. And so what I mean by time horizon is the time period over which we're measuring these benefits of improving water quality. So up until now, I've only been aggregating benefits between 2015 and 2050, which is actually a fairly short time frame. For context, most social cost of carbon models look at time horizons of 200 years or more. In these plots here, the top plot is looking at the 64% reduction scenario, the bottom, the 100%. I look at how these benefits and costs, the cumulative benefits and costs vary over time. So here, the red line is the costs of these two scenarios. And the stacked plots indicate the benefits. And so as you can see here, these benefits really increase significantly over time. And the way that I do this is that although the IM only goes out to 2050, I project out to 2200 using an average of the benefits between 2045 and 2050, and basically just add those on for each additional year. I then look at these benefits and costs under a range of different discount rates. So on the left, we're looking at a 0% discount rate, and then moving to the right, that increases from to 1%, 3%, and 5%. And so what this figure indicates is that I feel like a few things. The first is that the benefits really increase over time, and they increase the farther out you go in time. And second, the higher the discount rate, so moving from 0% to 5%, the value of those benefits really drops off. And at higher discount rates, so 3% or even 5%, those benefits really plateau beginning in the second half of the century. But if you're using a significantly low discount rate, so less than 3%, then the benefits may outweigh the costs beginning towards the end of this century, closer to 2100. So I'd like to highlight a few of the limitations of this work and also talk about a few ideas for future research. There are a few different limitations that might be leading to the underestimation of these benefit cost ratios. Probably first and foremost, I do not account for a range of other benefits associated with improved water quality. The benefits I quantify are grounded in methodologies that are commonly applied in environmental economics, but there are also a range of other benefits associated with improving water quality that are more difficult to quantify and more difficult to monetize. Second, in this analysis, I do not include any stated preference valuation approaches. All of these approaches are what's called revealed preference. And those are just kind of two different flavors of non-market valuation. And third, I don't account for any benefits accrued along the Quebec shoreline. This project focuses exclusively on Vermont. And then there are two limitations that might be leading to the overestimation of benefit cost ratios. The first of which is that I do not account for any costs of phosphorus reduction that might be being incurred by Quebec. And second, phosphorus load reductions will almost certainly occur gradually over time. The model assumes that all of these reductions occur in 2016. And by doing so, the model predicts that water quality might be improving more quickly than it actually is. In terms of future research, I think one of the most important areas is to project the IAM out beyond 2050. The IAM is really the backbone of the analysis, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty in projecting out beyond 2050 on the economic side without the IAM data backing that up. Another critical area for future research is expanding this to other areas of Lake Champlain. I would think that these benefits are quite different in other parts of the lake where there's more population, there's more tourism, where property values are higher, et cetera. So I think it'd be really interesting to compare how these benefits and costs change across different regions of the lake. And then the third area, I think it's important to consider the cost effectiveness of different interventions designed to reduce phosphorus loading. The cost estimates that I use are based on historical costs, but theoretically it is possible that we could be improving the cost effectiveness interventions, and these costs could be brought down significantly. So just a few final thoughts to wrap up. I just want to reiterate how much the integrated assessment modeling aspect of this has supported the economic side of this. I guess traditionally on the economics side of things, these types of analyses have been really done in the absence of a strong understanding of the biogeochemistry and how water bodies respond to changes in nutrient loads. And so having this type of modeling really supports the economic and policy analysis. Again, I also want to say that over this 35-year time horizon, so 2016 to 2050, the combined benefits do not exceed even the lower bound costs under any scenario. A few years ago, there was a review paper that came out that looked at, I think, almost 25 different cost benefit analyses related to water quality regulations. And what that review found is that most of these cost benefit analyses have very similar findings as what we found under the 35-year time horizon. However, this may really change if we extend that time horizon out to 2100 or even beyond that and apply a sufficiently low discount rate, so less than 3%. I also want to acknowledge that there is a lot of uncertainty in water quality valuation. This uncertainty manifests in a lot of different ways and is caused by a number of factors. And so I think given that uncertainty, there's some subjectivity in how you interpret these results. One way to interpret these results is you could say, well, the costs outweigh the benefits, therefore investments in water quality are simply unjustified. Or you can make the assumption that there are certain systematic limitations of cost-benefit analysis that lead to the inherent undervaluation of these benefits. And this has kind of been called what's the water value paradox. where in general, qualitative and participatory research finds very strong public support for initiatives in improving water quality, whereas the economic side of things often finds the opposite. So I think there's, some question of, is cost benefit analysis an instance of the tail wagging the dog? And lastly, I want to end by just saying that I think it's important to consider the distribution of these benefits and costs among different stakeholder groups across the Lake Champlain Basin, and really considering, are those benefits and costs being distributed equally, and whether there needs to be some sort of compensatory mechanism involved for those groups who are bearing the costs. I'd like to just thank my co-authors briefly, Chris Kaliba, Donna Rizzo, Asim Zia, and Taylor Ricketts. Their guidance and support in this project was really instrumental, and they contributed a lot to these analyses as well. You can find out more information about this project in the recent publication in the Journal of Environmental Management. And if you have any questions about it beyond the Q&A afterwards, please email me at either of the two email addresses below.